Analects of Confucius, a book that I read for the first time as a teenager and that I'm now reading for the second time as an old man. It absolutely did not occur to me. It did not occur to me that I would have less appreciation for this book in my old age than I had when I was a teenager. Think of all the things I've done in the last few decades. I studied Buddhism. I learned Pali. I've lived in Cambodia, Laos, Thailand, various parts of China. I started studying the Chinese language. I briefly studied Japanese. I've studied such an amazing array of things, history, politics, and languages of Asia. You might think that now, at age 41, in giving this book a second chance, that I would have some kind of deeper or more profound appreciation for the philosophy of Confucius, but I think that would be a little bit like saying to an atheist, if you were now to reread the Bible, would you have more or less appreciation for it, or more or less contempt, perhaps? I utterly despise the philosophy of Confucius, and it's very interesting that now, at 41, I'm rereading it simultaneous with a rereading of Lord Shangyang, normally known in English just as Lord Shang. Lord Shangyang's book that started the counter-Confucian current in Chinese philosophy, normally called in English legalism. What Shangyang is constantly preaching against is this horrifying vision of a society where advancement and promotion within the aristocracy and within the government is based on your ability to memorize and recite passages of poetry, where government is not in the hands of capable, competent men who know how to farm, who know how to lead an army, who know how to resolve a court case, who know how to collect taxes. No, where government is in the hands of a bunch of effete and useless aristocrats who spend all of their time standing around and carrying out fancy tea-drinking ceremonies, swilling wine, complimenting each other, singing songs together, memorizing and reciting poetry from the supposedly respectable compendium of literature known as the Book of Odes. What Shangyang is warning us against is the horrifying vision of precisely what Chinese society was to become. It was a society that, during the lifetime of Confucius, was based on advancement by memorizing and reciting the literature that was already ancient during the time that Confucius was alive. And many, many centuries later, the work of Confucius itself would replace the Book of Odes, would replace the Shijing also, the Book of Documents, it's called in English, strangely, would replace that more ancient literature as being the touchstone, the source text, the locus classicus, that every scholarly gentleman must memorize, must commit to memory, must write examinations about in order to get ahead. So Lord Shang represents a kind of pragmatic, mud and blood technocracy, saying, no, you need men who are responsible, you need to have promotion that's based on bravery in battle, and the people who are in charge of farming need to be competent in agriculture. One of his most strikingly modern sentiments is that government should not be based on superstition. Government should be based on statistics. You should use the statistical method in evaluating what you do with your land. Lord Shang is very big on the rule of law and order, and he very bluntly and brutally talks about the enforcement of law and creating the people's trust in government through law enforcement and so on and so forth. Whereas someone like Confucius has a completely superstitious and irrational notion of how government works and of how people come to trust their rulers and how rulers come to inspire good behavior in their people. What Confucius tells you, reading the text, shall we say, literally, I'll tell you in just a moment what I mean by literally and what would be the opposite of literally in this context. Reading the text literally, Confucius tells you again and again, it doesn't matter who wins the war, it doesn't matter who has the best soldiers, it doesn't matter who has the best army, money doesn't matter, don't worry about getting money. What matters is the performance of ritual correctly and cultivating your own mannerisms so that your whole life is kind of pervaded with ritual. Ritual not merely in the sense of sacrificing a goat at the altar to the gods, which they do. We get details about that that kind of ritual is a huge part of their life. But then also that in your relationship with your parents and fellow villagers and everyone, that almost every part of your life is pervaded with and defined by rite and ritual, shall we say. This is one side of it. And then the other side of it is this inner struggle for the cultivation of true virtue. And we're told again and again that performing the rituals alone, learning the customs, singing the right songs, memorizing the poems from the ancient Book of Odes, all of that would be meaningless if you didn't have the inner virtue behind it, if you weren't performing these rituals with sincerity. And if you do that, Confucius is literally teaching you, then those other things don't matter. You don't have to worry about earning money. You don't have to worry about whether or not you starve. You don't have to worry about whether or not the people of your kingdom are going to starve. You don't have to worry about who wins the war, because all you do is when you sit on the throne, when you govern, whether you're the mayor or the king of the whole kingdom, whatever, when you occupy that position of authority, everyone respects you and responds to you because you have this kind of ritual purity on your side. And then you have also this inner purity, this true virtue, this true goodness that he's very interested in telling you about cultivating. And that is what we would call complete bullshit. The only defense I can offer of Confucius, the only positive thing I can say about him, is that I do think in his own time, when he was himself alive, all of this was meant to be interpreted with a certain wink of the eye, a certain clin d'oeil. You know, he's standing there giving this morality lecture and saying, well, you know, refined gentlemen like you and I, we don't care about earning money. And in reality, all of his students are spending most of their time worrying about earning money. Well, you know, refined gentlemen like you and I, we don't spend our time chasing after beautiful women, something mentioned many, many times. And his students are, of course, obsessed with chasing beautiful women. And, you know, we can't be too concerned about military affairs. It's completely explicit in this text that Confucius himself and his students, they are practicing archery. They are asking each other questions about what would you do if you were the commander leading an army of 3 columns? What would you do in this and that military conflict? They study military conflicts from the past. They're asking questions about ongoing military conflicts at that time. They are political creatures, and they are creatures who are effete aristocrats. But to some extent, it remains a fighting aristocracy. It remains a concept of the aristocracy that's still very directly rooted in military service and, shall we say, carrying out the law, whether that's acting as a judge or jury or executioner, to be blunt. And the Confucianists were criticized for that also. So what most people would tell you is that when you read Lord Shang, you're looking at the sort of brutal mud and blood reality of politics, even of economics. Whereas with Confucius, you're looking at some kind of refined religious ideal of what it is to be a good man or lead a good life. I have to tell you, the religious ideal that's presented here, taking it seriously, is much more horrifying to me than the religious ideal of the New Testament, of Christianity. I'm an atheist. I'm a nihilistic atheist, and I have certainly spent much more time in my life worrying about and lecturing about what's wrong with Christianity currently and historically than I have spent time worrying about what was wrong with Confucianism. But the warning issued by Shang Yang, the warning issued by Lord Shang, is profoundly right. Nothing could be more horrible than to live in a society where advancement and promotion in government and in the aristocracy is based on your ability to memorize and recite erotic poetry written a few centuries earlier, where the king and the ministers select a young man and put him in charge of an army or put him in charge of agricultural reform on the basis of the fact that he has refined manners when sipping tea or swilling alcohol and standing around and quoting poetry and casually participating in archery contests. This is an absolutely horrible vision of how to organize a society, and it held back the development of China for many, many centuries. This really was, China's dark ages. This is the secret formula for why China never did make the progress that Europe did over a period of, say, 2,000 years. There's a whole lot wrong with Chinese society that we can see in germ or in principle here in the Analects of Confucius. Going further, though, even just inwardly personally, morally, ethically, I would rather try to live my life by sincerely interpreting and applying the principles that are in the New Testament, that are in Christianity, than living by these principles. These are bad principles. This is very bad advice for how to be a good person, even compared to a religion I don't believe in and despise, like Christianity. To give a little bit of credit where it's due, Christianity is both anti-clerical in terms of the actual text of the New Testament of the Bible, and it's quite anti-ritual. Remember that old line, let the dead bury the dead? It's not what goes into a man's mouth that defiles him, it's what comes out of his mouth. You have many, many passages where Jesus is telling you explicitly that the ways of the old temple, the Judaism of the temple in Jerusalem, are now over. And what a coincidence, this book was actually written in the context of the destruction of the temple. It very much emerged from its own political and historical circumstances, that instead the ethic of what it means to live a good life and be a good Jew, although we now think of this as Christianity, not Judaism, in its own time this was a kind of ersatz reform of Judaism, what it meant to be a good Jew was no longer going to be something defined by these rituals. So the anti-ritual element of Christianity alone makes it a much better philosophy to live by than this, which is ultimately mired in the backward-looking view of a man who lived in a period of time when the Zhou dynasty was falling apart and ending, and who was squarely facing backward towards the past, and said no to all the progress that's represented by someone like Shang Yang. Said no, let's go backward, not forward. Let's keep imitating our ancestors. Let's keep imitating them right down to the minor details of the type of cup you use when performing a certain ritual, and the ritual is performed in the palace and by the local kind of mayor or the local petty government officials. Let's continue to have a society that's utterly dominated by and defined by, what to you and I must be utterly meaningless details, like what should be the decorations on the ceilings and the columns of people in different stations of government, and how to perform funeral rituals, this sort of thing. The notion of ritual here, which includes acts just as crude as tribal people ritually sacrificing a goat or a lamb. I mean, it's no better than what you might think of as, a backward tribal people with their witch doctor killing an animal for magical and superstitious reasons. That kind of ritual is part of this life. But it's almost worse to see the way in which rite and ritual and ritualistic attitudes are supposed to infest and corrupt every element of your life, including your relationship with your parents, your relationship with your children, your relationship with your husband or wife. And of course, the delusion he asks you to participate in is that if only you will be pious enough, if only you will conform honestly and utterly with these rituals, then you will be rewarded with wealth without having to pursue wealth. That magically the universe, this is very much like the power of positive thinking in our times. And there's this hit book, The Secret. There's some ways in which this resonates with schlocky, hippie bullshit religiosity in the 21st century. If only you as a ruler practice this kind of purity inwardly and outwardly, then you will be rewarded with having a great kingdom and the people will obey you. You'll inspire the people to be good people, and there will be law and order. There will be law and order that doesn't rest on the use of brutality and force or even the quality of the laws you're writing or whatever. It doesn't come from these worldly sources. It comes from this supernatural and mysterious source. That is a worldview that I can say is somehow more anti-realist than Christianity. So that's my wistful reflection for you. The particular translation is excellent. The introduction, even though it's only about 10 or 12 pages, it's worth buying the book for those 10 or 12 pages in the introduction. Very informative, sums up a lot of, save you 4 years of going to university, frankly, if you just read the introduction twice. But the book itself is absolute garbage. And I close this video just by saying, we're living through a period of time in the year 2020 when Confucius has been transformed from being the great enemy of the Communist Party of China to being the mascot of the Communist Party of China. Today, all around the world, the Communist Party operates what's called the Confucius Institute. It's a chain of institutes all around the world. They've taken the name of Confucius and the idea of Confucianism, and they've made it into something that represents the new China in the same way that Mickey Mouse represents the Walt Disney Corporation. I don't have any sincere fear that China will revert to the mentality of the Dark Ages. But it's certainly a period of time when we all have to look at China with one eyebrow raised and ask, what is next?